I cry a river over you. You drove me, nearly drove me out of my head. Why? Remember all that you said, told me love others you've heard.
So I'll be the one.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dan Sasanis. I'm the Provost of Stony Brook University, and it's actually wonderful for me to be able to be here today and introduce the Provost lecture series. I've been on campus for only 5 weeks so far, so you have to excuse me for missing a couple of these wonderful events, but I think it is truly a delight to have it, and also to be in a position myself to welcome the members from the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I'd like to extend my apologies to the group, because I was really hoping to get out and see you today around 11 o'clock, and something came up, but I promised to come another time. I have to tell you that at the University of Michigan, where I was for the past 17 years, we did have a very strong and engaged Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in the community. It's a wonderful thing, and I was, in fact, one of their speakers at one point, and talked to them about electric cars and how they're going to save the planet, and I got some excellent questions, better than what I get from my students. So I look forward to come and welcome you and introduce you to one of your future events. Now, today's event is really special. We've been having the Provost lecture series for about 13 years now, and we had many speakers from many different areas, all excellent people who have talked about groundbreaking and transformational discoveries within our diverse disciplines in this university and beyond. And today we're going to have an outstanding, truly outstanding speaker. Is one of the top 20 most influential professionals in her field, who is going to tell us about how we can transform some of the healthcare practices. And again, I will leave this for a bit later on the introduction of Diane Meier. But I would like to say a few words about today's event and the sponsorship of the event. We are proud to co-sponsor it not only with Oli, but also with David and Amy Goodman, who are the children of the Goodman family, and I think I may have gotten it wrong before in the years, but it doesn't matter. The symposium, the Goodman Family Symposium, has been going on for 12 years already. The Provost Lecture Series has been going on for 13 years. I believe that it started out as a separate event, but we've been able now to bring it together in one unified forum. So the Goodman Symposium in '99 was originally named in the honor of George Goodman, an ophthalmologist who was an adjunct faculty member at Stony Brook University Medical School and very active in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. In addition to his teaching and medical practice, Dr. Goodman was deeply engaged in community and social issues. He was a founder of the Long Island chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility and sat on the Bayshore Public Library Board for 30 years. The symposium was launched a year after Dr. Goodman passed away to honor his interest in having a forum that would address current social issues of interest, both the university and surrounding communities. For a decade, the symposium was organized by George's wife, Dorothy Goodman, who was also very active in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. She was a retired school teacher, social worker, and lifelong peace activist. Over the years, Dorothy has been instrumental in bringing renowned speakers to our campus, including authors E.L. Doctorow and Alice Walker, former FDA Commissioner David Kessler, journalist Seymour Hersh, activist and TV host Phil Donahue, and many others. Dorothy Goodman passed away in 2009, and this year the symposium was officially renamed the George and Dorothy Goodman Memorial Symposium. We're so honored to have with us today their children, David and Amy Goodman, who are with us today, and they're going to pay tribute, first of all, to their parents and their legacy, and also to the event. So I would like to invite at this point, first David, to come up here and say a few words about your parents, and then Amy, who will introduce Diane Meier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for from our whole family. It's a particular honor this year, the 12th annual Goodman Symposium, but the first to also bear our mom's name. It is now the George and Dorothy Goodman Memorial Symposium. We have very big shoes to fill in trying to pull off what my mom did, I won't say effortlessly, but for many years in organizing these symposiums. I now know some of the joy and sorrow of trying to organize this only from afar, since I live in Vermont. But we're extremely lucky this year to have as our speaker of the first George and Dory Goodman Symposium, Dr. Diane Meier, who Amy's going to say a word about. The idea for this whole forum has always been to bring issues of concern, current issues of concern to both the university and the community at large. And that was a real interest of both of my parents. And this is a very special place at Stony Brook, the Lifelong Learning Center here, formerly known as the Round Table, that's what we always knew it as, was really the reason that my parents retired here. They kind of had their second life here. We grew up in Bayshore on the South Shore of Long Island, but in their later years, my parents were commuting to Stony Brook just to come to all these amazing lifelong learning programs. And I think it's especially fitting that the university has embraced this notion of really the whole life cycle, and we'll be speaking today also about this notion of care through the whole life cycle with what Dr. Meier is going to be talking about. So we hope to continue this tradition with the Goodman Symposium, and again, a special thanks to Dr. Meier, and I'll turn it over to my sister, Amy.
It's wonderful to come back to Stony Brook and to be here at Stony Brook University, the place my parents loved so much at the end of their lives. It meant so much to them. The Round Table and the university itself, just the stimulation of the environment. And it's something they instilled in all of us, this lifelong love of learning. You know, to be here today is also very special for us because of the speaker, and I only wish my parents could be here sitting in the front row to hear Dr. Diane Meier. My mom got to meet Dr. Meier in the last few weeks of her life at Mount Sinai Hospital, and she really transformed this utterly painful and for us at times hopeless time into a period of deep meaning that we will never forget. It was so critical at that point to be able to have those final conversations with our beloved mother at a time when she was in so much deep pain. And we consider Dr. Meier a kind of magician, a remarkable practitioner of a field that we were only introduced to 2 years ago, much too late. And I hope today, for some of you, for those of you who come over from Stony Brook Medical School, you are more familiar with this field. But those of you who aren't, I hope you listen carefully to Dr. Meier's words and you begin to spread the word. David and I this morning came from covering Occupy Wall Street, downtown Manhattan, and then hopped on the train to come here. I don't know if Dr. Meier would agree with this, but I think of the palliative care movement as the kind of Occupy movement of medicine. It's about compassion. It is about putting people over profits, and it is transformative. So it means so much to us to sit here to hear what Dr. Meier has to say. Afterwards, David and I will sit with her and have a conversation. Dr. Meier is director of the Center to Advance Palliative Care, a national organization devoted to increasing the number and quality of palliative care programs in the United States. Under her leadership, the number has more than doubled in the last 5 years. She was, when we met her, director of the Lillian and Benjamin Hertzberg Palliative Care Institute, professor of geriatrics and palliative medicine, Catherine Geisman, professor of medical ethics at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. Dr. Meier was named one of 20 people who make healthcare better in the United States by Health Leaders Media 2010. And her most recent book, Palliative Care, Transforming the Care of Serious Illness, was published in 2010. Dr. Meier has just flown in from Richmond, Virginia. She heads to Washington, D.C. tomorrow, so we're very honored that she has made this a stop on her lifelong tour as she lets people know about this movement that must be built all over the country and incorporated into legislation and healthcare policy in the United States. Dr. Meier.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? There's some really bright lights up here. That was really a wonderful introduction, Amy. Thank you so much. The honor and the privilege is really all mine. Like I'm sure many people in this audience, I'm a lifelong fan of Democracy Now! And had no idea when I was asked to come see a Mrs. Goodman in the hospital that it was that Goodman. Ironically, I was also a founding member of PSR way back in my medical training, so we have yet another connection. Turns out my dad and Amy and David's oldest brother, Steve, were colleagues and friends. So it was just one of those things that was clearly meant to be. So as I said, it's my honor and privilege to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I titled this talk, The Decisive Moment, because I actually do think the wheels, the planetary universe wheels are turning so that it is coming to be the moment when good things can happen for people. And I think Occupy Wall Street is one symptom of that. And I think, as Amy points out, palliative care is another symptom of that, that there's something happening at the collective unconscious and hopefully also conscious level that is changing at this point. So what I'm going to try to talk with you about today is to put the palliative care movement in the context of the U.S. healthcare system, to make sure you do not leave this room without knowing what palliative care is, that you understand why it is so important to healing our very broken healthcare system, and then lastly, why I think this is the decisive moment for palliative care and what we need to do to exploit that moment fully, because it's not going to come around again. So I love this quote, which I found randomly reading something else a couple weeks ago. It's a quote from a photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and his book, you can see the cover, was illustrated by Matisse back in the 1950s. He wrote, "The decisive moment, it is the simultaneous recognition of the significance of an event, as well as the precise organization of forms which give that event its proper expression." And I hope as we go through my material this afternoon, you'll see why I think we are in almost a photographic decisive moment for healthcare right now in general and for palliative care in particular. So just want to begin with what the core principles underlying my talk will be. And I want to start with this quote from Francis Peabody, who was a physician at Harvard Medical School and was speaking to the graduating students in 1921, and gave what is now very famous talk with this line in it, that the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. Now, this may seem unnecessary to say for some of you in the audience, but for those of us who work in healthcare, it is very necessary for this to be said and said and said again. And then it would be my position that we cannot care for our patients in the current healthcare system, that it is a raid against us in terms of what patients need. Therefore, it is our obligation, if we care about caring for patients, to improve the healthcare system. And so going back even further, in terms of first principles, many of us, when we graduate medical school, recite this oath. This is from Hippocrates in 400 before the Common Era. I will follow that system, which according to my ability and judgment, I consider for the benefit of my patients, and abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous. And Maimonides, about 1,000 years later, wrote, "The eternal providence has appointed me to watch over the life and health of thy creatures. May the love for my art actuate me at all times. May neither avarice, nor miserliness, nor thirst for glory, or for a great reputation engage my mind. For the enemies of truth and philanthropy could easily deceive me and make me forgetful of my lofty aim of doing good to thy children." And then he closes with this very profound last sentence: "May I never see in the patient anything but a fellow creature in pain." So, back to the United States in 2011. What are the ends of medicine? And let me see if I can get from behind this podium. Is this on? This mic? Can you guys turn this mic on? How about now? Yeah, okay. So does anybody can anybody in the audience hazard a guess of what the ends of medicine are in the United States in 2011? Money. Yeah. It's a marketplace. And what should they be? I mean, I've already quoted 3 different people who said what the ends of medicine should be about caring for the patient. And this is no one can ever tell me what the origin of this quote is, but it flies around a lot in palliative care circles, that the ends of medicine should be to cure sometimes, relieve often, comfort always. And I'm bringing you a quote from a hero of mine, a woman named Sherry Gleed, who is a health economist at Columbia and right now is working in the executive branch under the Obama administration at Health and Human Services. And she wrote this really remarkable paper titled, "What Changes in Survival Rates Tell Us About U.S. Healthcare." And this is one quote from the paper. "The nature of our healthcare system, specifically its reliance on unregulated fee-for-service and specialty care, explains both increased spending and deterioration in survival." So this is the first time a really rigorous scientific analysis, epidemiologic analysis, was done that pointed out not only what's perfectly obvious, which is that the fee-for-service way of reimbursing for healthcare is driving our entire nation into a ditch in terms of excess spending on healthcare, but much more profoundly, that marketplace system is also harming patients, that we die sooner because of it. And I'll show you some data to support that now. So I spent a year in Washington as a health policy fellow in 2009, 2010, actually about 18 months. I spent half the time on a Senate committee and the other half the time working in the Health and Human Services Secretary Sebelius's office. And there I learned about the value equation, which I had, I must confess, never heard of before I got to Washington. So the value equation in healthcare is how policymakers think about it. And very simply, value is quality in the numerator and cost in the denominator. So an example of a very high value medical intervention that is really does a lot for quality is low in cost might be what? Vaccines? maybe? Okay. Measuring blood pressure, maybe? And then something that's low value in healthcare would be something that has minimal additional value to patients, but costs a huge amount. MRIs, I'll show you some more data on that. Botox injections, that depends on your point of view. Well, some of these, like Provenge is a chemotherapy agent that costs $9,000 a dose, that only in a very small fraction of prostate cancer patients does it result in a 2-month prolongation of life. Ventricular assist devices, the artificial heart, cost about $500,000 per patient. Your taxpayer dollars cover this. That's a low-value healthcare intervention, very, very costly. Applies to very few people, has minimal benefit by comparison, for example, to prevention. So that's how they think about it. So the goal is to do things that improve value, meaning improve quality or reduce cost or both, to fix the system, preferably both. So numerator problems. I don't know how many of you read the Crossing the Quality Chasm report published by the Institute of Medicine a few years ago. It's actually quite profound, and one of the memorable examples that came from that report was that every day in an American hospital, the equivalent of 2 full 757 jetliners crash and burn and kill everyone on board from preventable medical errors in hospitals. That hospitals are so dangerous that 100,000 people per year die in them that would not have otherwise died. Okay, it's really interesting, because if 2 757s crashed and burned every day in the United States, somebody would do something. People would stop flying. There would be public uproar, outrage. So this happens every day in American hospitals, and it's not even in the consciousness of the American people at this point. We know that millions more are harmed by overuse of medical technology and interventions, underuse and misuse. Medical practice in the U.S. is based on any kind of scientific evidence less than half the time. About 1/8 of our population, 50 million people, has no insurance and no access to care. And really embarrassingly, for a country that considers itself to have the best healthcare system in the world, we rank 40th in quality and disease worldwide. So we rank 40th in infant and maternal mortality. 40th in childhood vaccination rate, after places like Albania and Poland and some Middle Eastern countries. Our self-concept bears no relationship to the facts. And then there's the denominator problems, the cost problems. I don't know about you, but I'm a faculty member of Mount Sinai, so I have this top-tier United Healthcare insurance that's supposed to be a great product. It's costing me a huge amount of money from my paycheck every 2 weeks. The deductible for the 4 of us is $10,000 a year. That means basically all our health care is out of pocket, because nobody's really sick, thank God. And if you see someone out of network, it's not covered. So this year we switched all our doctors to in-network because we just couldn't afford to go to the best person. Now we go to the person in-network because the cost is prohibitive, and this is happening all over the country. So I pay a huge amount for my insurance, I get almost nothing back, and I have no control over who I see. And people are afraid of socialized medicine. And as President Obama said repeatedly during the health reform debate, and it is true, and just read the paper about the super committee today, healthcare spending is the #1 threat to the American economy and the American way of life. These are great graphs that come from the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a sort of coalition of first world nations. So it's Scotland, New Zealand, Denmark, Canada, those kinds of places. And in the x-axis here on the left is years from 1980 to 2007. And on the left y-axis is spending per person on health care on an annual basis. And I'll give you all one guess which curve is the United States. The black one. Everybody else is clustered together in the colors. So this was 2007. At that point, it was roughly $6,500 per man, woman, and child every year in the U.S. Now it's about $7,700 per man, woman, and child in the U.S. every year, roughly twice the amount our nearest neighbor spends on health care. And then on the right-hand side, again, we have 1980 to 2007, and on the y-axis, percent of gross domestic product. That is the percent of our total economy that's spent on health care. And again, the black curve is the U.S., where at this point in 2007, we were at about 15%. We're now at above 18% of our total economy is spent on health care. Again, twice as much as our nearest developed nation neighbors. So you'd think we wouldn't be 40th, right, in quality. We're spending so much more than everyone else. So what is all this money buying us? We have the lowest life expectancy at birth, the highest infant and maternal mortality rate, the lowest infant and child vaccination rate, and the highest mortality preventable by health care in any of the OECD nations. And here's some examples of where the money is going. Somebody mentioned MRIs before. These are the number of MRI machines per million population in 2009 in OECD nations, and the light blue rectangle is the median for other first world countries, and that's, what is that, 8.5 MRI machines per million population is the median, and the US, way over on the left there, 26 MRI machines per million population. So what happens if you have such an oversupply of MRI machines? They get used. They get used. First of all, they got to be bought and paid for. They're multi-million-dollar devices. Secondly, insurance and Medicare and Medicaid pay lots of money to the hospital and to the radiologist for the conduct and interpretation of these scans. So they're like open spigots for money. I don't know how many of you have been in an ER in the last few years, but it is virtually impossible to get out of the ER without an MRI at this point. If you sprain your ankle, you will get an MRI. I promise you, you will. Check it out. And then here's where does the money go? It's often said that we throw a lot of money away on paperwork in the US, and here's the data to prove it. This is the amount of money spent per human being on administration, paper pushing, begging and pleading with insurance companies, filling out a different form for every insurance company, refilling out a different form when they deny your claim the first time, all of that. So in the OECD median is $74 spent on administration per man, woman, and child, and that's 3.4% of total healthcare spending. And guess what? The US, nearly $500 per year on nothing that helps people, on keeping the business of healthcare running. And that's about over 7% of our total healthcare budget is pure waste. So even the Wall Street Journal, this is during the second Bush administration, had on its front page this curve suggesting that even in the business world, people were starting to get worried. The x-axis here is 1970 to 2010. The left y-axis is enrollees in Medicare in tens of millions, and you can see it's up to nearly 40 million Medicare beneficiaries now. And the right y-axis is spending in hundreds of billions on Medicare. Now, my dad was a statistician, mathematician, but math was never my strong suit. I used to think it was because I was rebelling against my father, but now I know it's just I don't have that kind of brain. But I can tell that this is not linear. This is an exponential curve and clearly not sustainable. Again, this is why you have a very small number of your elected representatives sitting on this super committee and deciding whether they're going to cut 30% from the Medicare budget. And in fact, if they don't make a decision by Thanksgiving, that's exactly what's going to happen. At least that's what the law says is going to happen. A 30% cut from Medicare. That, you want to talk about death panels, rationing, and euthanasia? That's what that is. So we spent $2.9 trillion last year, and of that $2.9 trillion, 63% of it was spent on the 5 to 10% of the sickest, most vulnerable, most complex patients. And this is the patient population that needs and benefits from palliative care. This is why it's the decisive moment for palliative care. So people don't really understand that how disproportionate healthcare spending is. Most of the people in this audience are pretty healthy, Medicare or not. Your annual costs are trivial in the healthcare system. Your spending on healthcare is not what's driving us into the ditch. It's the 5% of the commercially insured population, 7% of Medicaid beneficiaries, 10% of Medicare beneficiaries that are spending 2/3 of $2.9 trillion on healthcare. So a mechanism of intervening on that very small fraction of very sick, very costly patients that both improves their quality and reduces cost is the secret weapon. It's the magic bullet. We just got to get it in, we got to convince the people in positions of power to make that happen. I love this New Yorker cartoon because it always strikes me how I can pontificate and talk on and on and on, and the New Yorker makes the point in one drawing with one line. And here is a mouse saying to a lion, "It is thorn-like in appearance, but I need to order a battery of tests." The physicians in the audience are not laughing because this is true. I like to tell the story, and it's not a story, it's true, of when I was on service in July with the brand new interns, medical students, residents. I like to be on service early in the year because they're still anxious to learn, they're still open to learning, they're still willing to listen to their attending. And the intern was presenting, she looked about 12 to me, but she was probably about 25. She's presenting to me a very frail, elderly, advanced dementia patient who had come from a nursing home, who had been in the hospital 4 times in the prior year with fever. And she probably thought that I was one of the few attendings in the hospital that would be interested in a patient like that, because in general, people with dementia are not considered to be good teaching cases in the hospital. But as a geriatrician, she correctly surmised that I was interested. And she's presenting the history. We don't have much history from the nursing home, just fever and decreased responsiveness. And the physical exam, not much there. This patient hadn't spoken a word or recognized anybody in a number of years. The complete blood count, the chem screen, the coagulation profile, the urinalysis, the urine culture, the chest x-ray, the cardiogram. Now, you can't even walk within half a block of a hospital without getting all those things done. That's just walk in the door and you get all that stuff. So, but I wanted her to like think about all the information she had presented to me and to start thinking about what the information meant. And I interrupted her and said, "What was your thinking at this point? What was your synthesis at this point?" Because we're trying to teach these young physicians to, you know, have inductive and deductive reasoning, to use the data and come up with a series of possibilities and rule in or rule out those possibilities based on the evidence that they'd gathered. And clearly I had interrupted her script, her spiel to me, because she couldn't break. And she said, "But Dr. Meier, I'm not done presenting the results." And she was clearly upset. So I took pity on her and apologized for interrupting and said, "I'm sorry, please finish. We'll talk about it when you're done." At which point she proceeded to present to me the results of the CAT scan of the head, chest, abdomen, and pelvis. That's about $5,000 worth of imaging, because it is thorn-like in appearance. But I need to order a battery of tests. This was last July, 3 months ago. This is how the physicians that will take care of you in the future are being trained right now, all across the country. So I find it interesting that nowadays I read the health policy literature. This is Health Affairs. And the people who write in the policy literature have found it necessary to resort to apocalyptic biblical language to convey to the rest of us just how serious this mess is. So in this one, they called it original sin. Providers and patients still largely determine what care is needed without a budgetary framework to consider both benefit and costs. This is the original sin of health policy, and no reform can be adequate without addressing it. So what are the consequences of this original sin, this fee-for-service model with no consideration of benefit as well as costs? First one I've already said to you, which is that healthcare is not a system, it is a marketplace. It's like it's selling a commodity. Patients have become a means to another's profit. And this is not an exaggeration, rather than an end in themselves. And the consequence of that, of course, is that doctors and nurse practitioners and others who write the prescriptions or order the imaging study or refer the patient for the procedure are the middlemen. Without us, the test wouldn't be done. The drug wouldn't be given, the procedure would not occur, the money would not be made. We basically, we are the connector between the payer and the manufacturer. And obviously this has had, in my view, a fundamentally polluting and corrupting influence on the medical profession. And just a couple of examples. I was speaking to a group of geriatricians, academic geriatricians who teach in medical schools and work in teaching hospitals, and one of them raised his hand and said very matter-of-factly that his annual bonus was linked to the number of imaging studies he ordered every year. So if he ordered more MRIs or CAT scans, he got paid more. You know, there's nothing to call that other than corrupt. And this is a geriatrician. This isn't even somebody who makes any money. Or owns the device in any way. So even that group is being subtly and not so subtly pressed into the marketplace. There's been at least a 5-fold increase in concierge medicine, where people go outside of regular Medicare, pay a fee, an annual fee to a doctor, in order just to get regular high-quality primary care. People feel they have to go outside just to get a doctor who will answer their calls and who will see them the next day if they're sick. There was in the Times and a bunch of blogs a few months ago that the new cardiology guidelines that tell cardiologists when somebody should have a defibrillator or a ventricular assist device or a certain drug or an angioplasty, that the doctors who wrote those guidelines that tell other cardiologists how to practice, 2/3 of them were on the payroll of the companies they were writing guidelines about. Now, this was challenged and critiqued at the time, and the people at the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, who were hosting this guideline development said they could not identify any cardiologists with expertise in the field who were not on the payroll. So, it's a problem, and it's hurting my beloved profession in a very profound way. We've already talked about how healthcare uses more than 1/5 of the economy. Patients suffer in this system. One of my colleagues, Charles Von Gunten, who is a palliative care doc, recovering oncologist, calls it medical torture, what we do to patients in hospitals in the name of taking care of them. Of course, when we spend this much money on health care, there's no money for public education, there's no money for clean air, there's no money for bridges or safe roads, there's no money for the post office, there's no money for anything else. And we do have to ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to live in? Because if you can't drive across a bridge that's safe, that affects the rich and the poor. So we're sacrificing the good life for the collective as well as the good life for individuals with our highly imbalanced budget priorities. And I think one of the things that is most telling to me is that when I graduated from medical school in the Paleolithic age in 1977, and when I graduated from medical school, the top 5–10% of the class all went into general practice, family practice, general medicine, or pediatrics. That's what the best and the brightest did. It was about service. It was about public service. That was the highest value. So how many years later is it now? 30? 40 years later, the top 5 to 10% of medical students in every class in the United States, what are the 3 top specialties? Neurosurgery. Ophthalmology's in the top 5. Dermatology, plastic surgery. Nobody with any self-respect would have chosen any of those fields when I went to medical school. Now, they are highly competitive, and the smartest kids are competing for those spots. We should really be upset about this as a nation. And yet, why does this happen, do you think? Why do you think young people who started out pretty idealistic when they applied to medical school end up deciding to be plastic surgeons? So the average debt, this is across the country, for people going to medical school is $130,000. At Mount Sinai, my medical school, it's $250,000. I mean, it's so expensive, A, that either you're independently wealthy or you are in hock for that amount when you graduate. So if after graduating medical school, and many of these kids also have college loans to pay back, and they haven't been working because they've been in med school. If you ever want to grow up and have a family, pay a mortgage, pay your bills, you've got to find a job that pays. And if you're in general medicine or peds or geriatrics, that's the Mother Teresa part of medicine. You do not make an adequate living, barely to have a middle-class life, much less pay back that kind of loan. So, as I said earlier, the system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. In the other OECD nations, you don't pay for medical school, the government pays for medical school. In England, people who go into general practice make literally twice as much as specialists. Guess what happened? They got lots of general practice people there. So we could fix this. It's fixable through public policy. And again, here's one drawing from the New Yorker. This is a patient with his doctor, and the doctor is plastered with drug company and device manufacturer labels. And you know, if you look at the interns and residents in medical school and look in their pockets, you will see one drug advertisement after another on their pen, on their pocket card, on their stethoscope. It's pervasive and it's corrupt. All right, so what can be done? There are 2 primary options to get a handle on all this spending. And they're both basically about gradually detoxing. It's like an addiction. The US healthcare system and fee-for-service is like an addiction. So if you cold turkeyed this healthcare system from fee-for-service, it would just implode. It would not be able to function. So you have to very gradually shift the culture and how people think about money to support their work. So there's 2 options. One is to stop paying for things that don't help people or that cause harm by something called comparative effectiveness research. And an example of that is it just means that the government should require head-to-head trials before approving a new device or a new drug. So I bet you know there's a new antidepressant on the market every week. You see them on TV, right? And they're FDA approved. What did they have to compare that new antidepressant to get it approved? Placebo. Exactly. They didn't have to compare it to Prozac or Zoloft or any of a number of other long-standing, now generic, much cheaper drugs, because that's not a requirement by law in this country. So if you're a drug company, your bread is buttered on changing 1 carbon on an antidepressant, calling it something new, advertising the hell out of it, comparing it to placebo, getting FDA approval. That's why we're not getting any new breakthrough drugs for new diseases in this country. That's expensive. It's much cheaper to do another Me Too drug for cholesterol or blood pressure or depression. And that's what drug companies are doing in this country. And you might wonder why our government permits that. Why does our government permit that? Yeah, the drug companies put a lot of money into the re-election of our congresspeople and our senators, and they make sure that that rule doesn't change. The FDA has wanted to change this forever. The The other way of controlling the cost curve is, the dirty word is capitation, but it's basically putting the healthcare system on a budget and saying that the healthcare system has a finite amount of money, and we're going to have to figure out how to get the most value, the most quality for our buck. The money is not infinite. We've been behaving as if it's infinite, and we are still behaving as if it's infinite, but the party is over, and the spigot is about to be turned off. So we got to figure out another way. And you may have heard some of these phrases thrown around: accountable care organizations, medical home, bundling payments. They're all just fancy words for capitation or managed care, putting it on a budget. They're words that are perhaps more politically acceptable, or were. So what's the first one? Comparative effectiveness research requires scientific comparison and then a willingness to live with the results, which means, of course, that somebody's going to lose money. So, for example, if you find a great example of comparative effectiveness research was somebody did research on back surgery for back pain, and they compared back surgery to physical therapy. What do you think they found? Physical therapy was better. This was government-funded research. It was a randomized controlled trial, very high-quality research. Guess what happened? The orthopedic surgeons lobbied Congress so heavily that the entity that funded the research was nearly put out of business, which was AHRQ, the Agency for Health Research and Quality, which is like the NIH. They defunded it based on the lobbying activities of the orthopedic surgeons and the device manufacturers. So that's the political reality of what goes on, and that's why we don't do comparative effectiveness research in this country. It's been labeled rationing and death panels by some of our elected representatives, and it is now politically untouchable. When I was in Washington, you could not say the term comparative effectiveness research without people looking at you and saying, are you in favor of Obamacare? Are you in favor of rationing and death panels? That's what that term has come to mean. And I love this quote from my colleague Bob Wachter, who is a hospitalist, who is very good at the understatement. And he said, American political discourse is not yet mature enough to support realistic discussion about difficult subjects. Isn't that great? So true. And option two is putting our healthcare system on a budget or taking risks. So we know, for example, that the VA, that Kaiser, that the Mayo Clinic, which works on a fixed budget, actually delivers much higher quality care than the mainstream healthcare system. The VA, which is often looked at as the last refuge for the poor, delivers much higher quality care than the mainstream healthcare system with every single quality measure that you can look at, including control of diabetes, number of people getting screened for colon cancer, control of blood pressure, etc. But that flies against, that's a socialized medicine system, so it can't be better, right? So that doesn't get any publicity either. We know what the characteristics of success are. Big system, electronic medical record, good communication between the hospital and the community setting, lots of primary care docs who pay attention to shared goals, not just their own personal goals. This does not characterize the U.S. healthcare system right now. So that's the background. That's the political context in which palliative care finds itself in 2011. So why is palliative care central to the success of any attempt to reform the healthcare system? Remember, I told you that it's the 5 to 10% of the sickest patients that are driving 2/3 of the spending. And that's our patient population. Now, here's another way of looking at it. On the left hand is all Medicare beneficiaries. The blue part of that rectangle is the 90% of Medicare beneficiaries that are not sick, that might have high blood pressure or arthritis. They account for about 1/3 of Medicare spending. And the orange part of that rectangle, 10% of Medicare beneficiaries account for 2/3 of the spending. And that's the subset that has 5 or more chronic conditions, or very serious illness like cancer, or a massive stroke, something that causes a lot of need for health care. Now, I'm not saying that this 10% shouldn't be the most expensive. It should be the most expensive. Sick people are the ones who need the health care. We should spend more money on the sickest people. That's not wrong. It's right. That's what the healthcare system exists for. It's a safety net for the sickest people. The problem is how much of that money is pure waste and how much of it is harmful, overtly harmful. So what is palliative care? Now you guys can read this, but the reason I put this definition up here is this is the government's definition of palliative care. This is what the government wrote about palliative care when they were defining the Medicare hospice benefit. Do people here know what the eligibility criteria are to get into hospice in the United States? Anybody? It's actually 6 months. 2 doctors have to sign a piece of paper saying you are likely to be dead in 6 months. How good is the medical profession at predicting who's going to be dead in 6 months? It's impossible. People are incredibly variable. I mean, if you have heart failure or emphysema or kidney failure or dementia, you could live 3 months or 15 years. And it's really hard to predict. So that's the first problem here, is that this rule is absurd. And then what's the second eligibility criterion for hospice? What does the patient have to do? The patient has to accept the label of dying, literally sign a piece of paper saying, I know I'm dying, and agree to give up regular insurance coverage for life-prolonging care. So the patient not only has to say, Uncle, I'm beyond the pale now, I'm no longer part of the human race, I'm dying, and I give up my claim to treatment that's going to help me prolong my life in order to get this wonderful care, which is hospice. And it's a terrible choice. Why should people have to wait? Why should people have to give up effective care in order to get high-quality hospice care? And that is the problem. And that is why the palliative care movement has grown up. And this cartoon shows you what the new model is. That from the point of diagnosis of a serious illness, and throughout the course of that illness, and this can be a 20-year period. It can be a 3-month period or a 20-year period. You need both curative or life-prolonging treatment and treatment focused on making sure that you have an acceptable quality of life at the same time, not sequential. Does it make any sense for them to be sequential? Absolutely not. I mean, it's important that dying people get good, high-quality palliative care, but it's also important that people who aren't dying but have serious illness get good, high-quality palliative care. And by the way, that is a much larger group of patients and a very costly group of patients. So these are the domains. It's physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering. It's communication about what matters and how the healthcare system can help people accomplish what matters to them. And it's making sure that they don't fall through the cracks moving between these different segments of the healthcare system. Now, why did I title this The Good News? The public has never heard of palliative care. Why is it good news? That might be one way of looking at it. The suggestion was that it would be a threat to the healthcare system because if the public knew, they would demand it, and I think that's true. The good news is they don't have a prejudice about it. They don't already think that it's the same as hospice. In contrast, what do doctors think? Doctors, particularly those in my generation, baby boom generation, believe that palliative care is brink of death care. And that's why they don't refer patients, because it's not appropriate till you're about to draw your last breath. So if you're suffering and you're not about to draw your last breath, that's just suck it up. They don't refer. So we have a big challenge to get the medical profession to understand that palliative care is based on need, not prognosis. But the public, very fortunately, has no idea what it is. And if we get some funder to support it, a public awareness campaign could be very powerful and effective in getting the public to demand high-quality care. So that's our strategy. And this is the language that we tested with about 1,500 likely voters in June. And this language was very strongly endorsed by members of the public, ranging from Tea Partiers to progressives, regardless of political affiliation. Everyone said they wanted this. They want palliative care as specialized medical care for people with serious illness. This type of care is focused on providing patients with relief from symptoms, pain, and stress of a serious illness, whatever the diagnosis. The goal is to improve quality of life for both the patient and the family. Palliative care is provided by a team, and teams seem to be very positively ranked by the public, of doctors, nurses, and others who work with the patient's other doctors, so you don't give up your other doctors, to provide an extra layer of support. The term extra layer of support was actually the top-ranked phrase in terms of what people wanted. Palliative care is appropriate at any age and at any stage in a serious illness and can be provided together with curative treatment. So if you take nothing else home from tonight, just take that. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data, not much for lack of time, that shows, so I've convinced you that we have a problem in the healthcare system, right? It's broken, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of unnecessary expenditure. I've told you that I think palliative care is a good idea. I haven't proved to you that palliative care actually does solve the problem. So I want to show you a little data on that. The first finding is that palliative care does improve quality of life and the patient and family experience of care, but it also markedly reduces spending. And I'll show you a little data on that. This is the inverse relationship between cost and quality. We have cost on the x-axis and quality of care on the y-axis, and you can see the relationship is inverse, as reported by family members of people who died in hospitals. The more money that was spent, the worse the quality of care, according to the family. This is another study that compared family survivors of patients who died at home with hospice to family survivors of patients who died in an ICU or in a hospital. Family members of patients who died in an ICU had a 5-fold increased risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. Families whose loved one died in a hospital had a 9-fold increased risk of prolonged grief disorder. So it's not just the suffering and trauma to the patient. It is lifelong suffering and trauma to the survivors, which talk about costly. Costly in terms of suffering, costly in terms of the economy, costly in terms of more demands on the healthcare system. Here's a guy in a drugstore in the section that says, "Good luck with the American healthcare system." So here's some more data. This was a randomized trial of patients with newly diagnosed cancer who were randomly assigned to get best cancer care. This was at Harvard, arguably the best cancer care on the planet. And the intervention group got best cancer care plus palliative care. So everybody got best cancer care, but one group also got palliative care. Not surprisingly, to those of us who work in the field, those who got palliative care had better quality of life, less depression, less symptoms, less likelihood of ending up in the hospital, getting chemo in the last 2 weeks of life, more likelihood of dying in hospice. But very surprisingly, and got a huge amount of press, the palliative care group lived nearly 3 months longer than the usual care group. I will tell you that many of my colleagues, I was in Washington when this study came out, called me on my cell phone to say, this cannot be true. Cannot be true that people do better with palliative care than without it. It was so counter to their bias that palliative care is brink of death care and is associated with death. But when I talk to public audiences, no one is surprised, because the public understands that misery is bad for you. Why do you guys think getting palliative care at the same time as best cancer care might have prolonged the life of these patients? Any ideas? Less anxiety for the patient and the family. Look at the depression. We know that depression in every disease in which it's been looked at is an independent predictor of death. No matter what disease you have, if you are also depressed, you will die much sooner. So the depression rate was much lower. What else might have accounted for this? Better symptom management. Severe pain is really bad for you. You take to your bed, curl up in a ball, and turn to the wall. It's not a good way to keep alive, and it doesn't make you want to be alive either. What did I tell you about the risk of hospitals? Hospitals are very dangerous. And the sicker you are, the more dangerous they are. So say you have lung cancer and you're immunosuppressed from chemotherapy and radiation, and you come into the hospital because you ran out of pain meds and you were in a pain crisis, or nobody had given you an appropriate bowel regimen and you hadn't pooped in 8 days. So you end up in the hospital and you catch a resistant infection because the hospital is full of resistant infections. You die from that resistant infection because you have no immune function. Avoiding the hospital, I think, was a key predictor of the better survival, that this group had that and the reduced depression. But it's going to take more research to really figure that out. And note here that this is the office setting. This is the community setting, not the hospital, where these people were getting palliative care. These are a couple of papers from our group that found very marked cost avoidance. This one was in the Archives of Internal Medicine. This one was in Health Affairs, looking at impact on Medicaid beneficiaries. This is the growth of hospital palliative care since 2000. In 2000, there were about 600 hospital palliative care teams. In 2009, 1,560, and that's the most current data we have because it's about a year behind the data that we get. There's a fair amount of state-by-state variation. The darker blue your state is, the more likely you are to have most of your hospitals have a palliative care team. So Vermont gets an A. Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, Washington, Washington, D.C., and Rhode Island get an A. There are 2 F states, Mississippi and Delaware. The whole nation as a whole went from a C to a B between 2008 and 2011. So it's improving, but if you're in the South, you're in trouble, basically. And here's New York State got 76% of our hospitals report a palliative care team as of 2009. So what's our strategy for bringing this kind of care more broadly across the nation? First, we need to do a public awareness campaign with patients and families and future patients and families so everybody knows what palliative care is and demands it. It's very important to have the public be empowered. The healthcare system will not get better without it. Secondly, no doctor, nurse, social worker, or chaplain should be allowed out on the unsuspecting public without adequate training in pain management, in symptom management, in how to communicate about years of my life working on achieving these 3 goals. And just going to close with my favorite quote from Helen Keller, who wrote a great essay that I recommend to you called Optimism in 1903. And she wrote, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is full also of the overcoming of it." Thank you very much.
So we're just going to have this conversation for about 20 minutes, and if you have any questions, think of them, and we'll also call on you from the audience in a few minutes if you have particular questions. Dr. Meier, when you talk about a palliative care team, who is included in this?
The typical palliative care team includes a doctor, a nurse, often a nurse practitioner, an advanced practice nurse, a social worker. Many also include chaplains. Ours, in addition, includes licensed massage therapists, therapeutic yoga experts, who I think are probably the most important members of the whole team. But it depends on your hospital size. If you're a 50-bed rural hospital, you don't need a team of that size and that level of commitment. You probably need a nurse practitioner with extra training who has other members of the team she can reach out to or work with when necessary. So the makeup of the team has to fit the needs of the setting.
And with that Alzheimer's patient that the intern came to you and talked about the care that she had gotten, what do you feel she should have done? What would you have done?
Well, there's lots of data that the more Alzheimer's patients go back and forth, it's called churn, between the nursing home and the hospital, the worse their outcomes. The higher their likelihood of death, the higher their likelihood of painful interventions, including painful things like blood drawing, which if you're demented and you don't understand why people are sticking needles in you, must be experienced simply as torture. And that nursing homes can very effectively treat infections in the nursing home. So if I were king, I would basically say to nursing homes, you're perfectly capable of treating routine urinary tract infections or aspiration pneumonia at the patient's home, which in this case is the nursing home, where she doesn't have to leave her familiar aide, her familiar nurse, who are in fact her family at this point, and be thrust into a group of strangers in an ambulance, 6 hours in an emergency room if she's lucky, then a whole new group of strangers upstairs, blood tests every day. I mean, it's obvious that that's not good quality. Yet all of the financial incentives right now are aligned that way. That is, nursing homes get no money. They're totally underfunded, and Medicare will pay for that ambulance ride, that emergency room visit, and that hospitalization. So all the money is incenting the worst care, and it just needs to be fixed. It's a policy problem.
I remember when we met you, it was about 2 weeks into my mom's, what ended up being a month-long stay in the hospital. And just to share with our audience what this kind of care looks like, I remember that one of the most striking things that you did when you came to my mom, who'd had 2 weeks of very tall doctors in long white coats standing over her as she lay in the bed, talking sometimes to her, mostly to us, lots of jargons and scary phrases flying about. The first thing you did was to kneel down and get at her level so that you could look her in the eye and engage her in her own health care. She was feeling very crappy at that point, but she suddenly had energy and was able to, in spite of the medicine she was on, I remember she looked very intently at you and you at her, and you and she then began to have a conversation that we watched instead of her watching a conversation about her. And it was the beginning of transforming her health care in a very positive way at what seemed to be a very hopeless time. You brought hope into that setting. I also remember you sharing with us your own frustration that we were 2 weeks into this, very painful odyssey, and it had been 2 weeks before you had even been called. And I remember asking you about that and why did it take so long. And you talked about that even in your own house, you had your challenges to persuade your colleagues that what you did was worthwhile. Can you talk about that? How are your colleagues receiving what you have to say?
So one of the slides I skipped over, I'm going to go back to just to show you that there's hope. Okay, so this was a survey that was released yesterday or the day before by the National Journal. That was a survey of a random sample of general practice doctors about their exposure to palliative care during medical education and their attitudes towards palliative care. And you can see that the ones who are under 39 had a great deal of exposure, and I'll show you on the next slide how positive they were, and my age group had almost no exposure. So there's hope for the future because there are palliative care teams in most teaching hospitals and medical schools. So now the young people are at least exposed to a parallel or complementary model of paying attention to what the patient and the family need and care about. So it's improving. But I would say there are probably at least 5 and probably more barriers to physicians working with their palliative care colleagues. The first is the lack of training and the assumption that it's what you do when the patient is moribund. That being the training, actually. The second is that if what you have been trained to do during medical school residency and fellowship is focus only on your disease process, only on your procedure, only on your drugs that you're an expert in, you literally do not know how to do anything else. That is all you know. And doctors, like many other professionals, are not comfortable in spaces where they don't feel in command and knowledgeable. And we unconsciously trivialize or render unimportant that we know nothing about. And I learned a very important lesson from an oncologist at a different medical center. He and I were co-managing a woman named Judy who had lung cancer, and whom he had kept going for 6 years, which is a very long time with metastatic lung cancer. She was about my age, lovely person, psychotherapist, just great person. And she found me about 2 years before she died because she could tell that this oncologist could not talk about anything other than the next chemo. And she wanted to be prepared. She felt that it wasn't going to go on forever. So she and I and he worked together for 2 years. I'm managing her pain and talking to her about the future and what mattered and her worries about her college-age daughter and all that. And Abe and I, the oncologist, were in frequent contact. And then one day she came in to see me and she said, Abe told me he was going to recommend intrathecal chemotherapy. And that's chemo directly into the brain, into a metastatic, she had lung cancer in her brain that was affecting her ability to remember and concentrate and ability to work. And Abe recommended chemo directly into the brain. And she came to ask me about whether I thought that was a good idea. And I was old enough not to say, oh, that's absolutely ridiculous, don't even think about it. I said, I really don't know, Judy, this is not my area of expertise. I'll call Abe and ask him. And one of us will get back to you. So I called Abe after Judy left, and I said, Abe, Judy was in today, and she said that you had recommended intrathecal chemotherapy for her brain mets, and without missing a beat, he said, that won't help her. So I took a deep breath and didn't say something that I would later regret. And I said, do you want me to encourage Judy to go ahead with it? And he said, and this was a light bulb moment for me, I don't want Judy to think I'm abandoning her. And then I understood so much about the things that my colleagues do that seem inexplicable to me. It's the only way he knew to show his love and care for her was to offer another procedure, because he had no other arrows in his quiver. And it was interesting because I don't think he was consciously aware of that was motivating him, because as soon as he said that out loud, I don't want Judy to think I'm abandoning her, he paused for a second, he said, we're not going to do that. Because it became conscious, and he was able to make a different decision. But that taught me a lot. And there's, the bottom line is there's a lot of suffering among doctors. There's a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder among doctors. Everybody's suffering in this situation. Everybody feels like they're failing at every level. So, it's the system that's broken.
So even though palliative care is not only end-of-life care, what you offer in end-of-life care is extremely important and really revolutionary. In a society that is so afraid of death and talking about it, yet engages in war all the time. If you could share your approach, one of the things you said was that pain is unhealthy. There's a certain attitude that you just bear up under the pain. how you deal with pain, and then what you encourage families to do as a family member is going to die.
So those are two separate questions, is how do we address pain and how do we help families relearn what families used to know? Because all deaths occurred at home since humans were on this planet until very recently. And so we've lost our species memory or knowledge, just as we've lost our ability to do birth at home. I mean, what could be more universal and more natural than birth and death, but they've both been hidden behind curtains in the hospital for a couple generations. So, but on pain, what we teach is that pain is a medical emergency. It is as important as crushing substernal chest pain or a plummeting blood pressure or someone who's hemorrhaging out. You drop everything. You do not leave the bedside until it is under control, and you stay with the patient until you get it under control. Now, what is required for a doctor to feel confident that he or she can manage pain, the same as we are taught to feel confident about crushing substernal chest pain or a plummeting blood pressure or hemorrhage? All of us are taught to manage those emergencies without even thinking about it. We know what to do. It's good training. Pain should be the same. But what's it going to take? It's going to take training. Most medical students and residents graduating today actually do not know how to manage pain. So, as I said, they render it less important because the discomfort of not knowing what to do is too painful. And acknowledging that you are helpless in front of this, and so you can't let yourself admit that because it's too painful, you feel too guilty, so you just don't pay attention. And it's very distressing to watch that. And it was seeing people in pain that motivated me to get into palliative care in the first place, because I couldn't bear it. But it's, you know, it can be taught like anything else. You have to teach people how to use opioid analgesics. You have to teach them how to manage side effects. You have to teach them how to use these drugs safely, because they can be harmful if they're not used safely. You have to teach other modalities of pain management. The most important thing you do, though, is you listen to the patient and you believe the patient. And you tell that patient you're not going to leave their bedside till that pain is below a 5 on a scale of 0 to 10. And you do that. You don't leave. Just your presence and your validation that this is unacceptable and it has to be fixed is 90% of the battle. Because people are so used to being ignored and feeling like they're not human, that they're saying they're in pain and people are ignoring them. It's terrifying. So we got to fix that. It's got to be part of the training. It's got to be part of quality measurement. It's got to be part of never events, that a patient should never be in excruciating pain for any length of time. And if that happens, it'd be as bad as cutting off the wrong leg. That's what we're working towards. In terms of death, the interesting thing is that physicians think that patients and families don't know that it's happening and don't want to know about it. And of course the patients and families do know, because they can see with their own eyes what's happening, and the patient always knows, because the body tells them what's happening. But as long as physicians are silent about it and are acting like it's not really happening, the patient and family stop trusting their own judgment, because they want to trust the doctor. So it's like this folie à trois of the elephant's here, but everyone's facing the other way. So the first thing I do, and that we teach in palliative medicine, is to use the D word. Your mother is dying. To say what is known, what is clear. And then just pause and let people process that. And then ask, you know, have you ever taken care of someone who has died before? What was that experience like? Because it's very important to know if family members had a horrible experience with another relative or with someone else in their family or a friend, because that's what they're envisioning now. So it's very important to get that. And the majority have never seen anyone die and have never been with someone who has died. Remarkably, when you think about it. It's just so hidden. And then I ask if people want to know what to expect. And almost everyone does want to know what to expect. And then we talk through what is the normal dying process. And dying is just as normal as birth. And actually it is a lot like birth in reverse, except it's way less painful than birth, speaking from personal experience. In birth, not in death. It's actually, the wisdom of nature is pretty remarkable. 90% of patients just get sleepier and sleepier. And then sink into a light coma, a deeper coma, and then die. About 10%, 1 out of 10, have a more difficult time, usually with agitation or restlessness, which we call delirium, and that can be managed quite effectively with medications. There are changes in breathing pattern that occur in the normal dying process that are very frightening for families to watch if they don't know that it's normal. You tell them the breathing's going to be irregular. There are going to be pauses in the breathing. There's going to be some gurgling or rattling noises which are completely normal and is just air moving across water and is not distressing to your loved one. That all these things which are unfamiliar can be very scary, but when you normalize it, because it is normal, then people know what to expect. And they can handle it as they have for millennia. And ideally, we want to get people home because that's where patients want to be, if families feel able to manage this. And there's a box of meds in the refrigerator that are liquid and very concentrated, so that if someone is having pain, you can give just droppers of a very concentrated morphine solution under the tongue and get the pain under control in 15 minutes. The same for shortness of breath, the same for nausea, the same for agitation or anxiety. All the meds are concentrated liquid forms with a dropper that a family member can administer and get a symptom under control immediately at home. Because that's what families are afraid of, is that they won't be able to handle suffering, that it won't be safe. It's not that hard to tell people, this stuff is not that hard. You just have to give people the information. And you have to have somebody at the other end of the phone, 24/7.
And the second part, which is the emotional part, what you want, how you want to deal with your passing loved one, what you want to say.
So I think the other key point, thank you for reminding me because I forgot, the key point is the physical stuff is important because until people feel safe about the physical stuff, they can't do the important stuff. So we started with the physical stuff. The important stuff is the normal developmental tasks of this stage of life. Just as there are normal developmental tasks in infancy and childhood and young adulthood, there are normal developmental tasks towards the end of life. And those mostly have to do with relationship healing and building. So the developmental tasks of the last stage of life are things like saying thank you. Thank you for being my mother. Forgive me. Forgive me for anything I may have done that caused you pain. I forgive you for anything you may have done that caused me pain. I love you. And goodbye. And it's interesting because when you work with families who did not get a chance to say those things, that's what they keep saying. I never got a chance to say goodbye. I never got a chance to say goodbye. And it haunts people for their whole life because you don't get it back, which is why I think it's such a central responsibility of physicians to tell families when it's time, because families don't know. Remember what the people did in the buildings on September 11th, 2001? The buildings and the planes, what did they do?
Phoned home.
Hey,
What did they say?
goodbye.
I love you and goodbye. What was more important to these people who had minutes to live in a terrifying, inexplicable, painful death? Saying I love you and saying goodbye. Yet we don't help people with this in hospitals.
You've showed us some very daunting and even depressing slides about how high the deck is stacked against people wanting to make change. We've witnessed what has happened to a president who, even as he has backpedaled and diluted the kind of change he's spoken of as it relates to health care, has nevertheless been under a withering attack, an effective attack. What gives you hope that you can change the system?
Well, this slide gives me hope. Young people give me hope. Occupy Wall Street gives me hope. Palliative care is Occupy Health Care. The best and the brightest medical students and residents are choosing to train in palliative care because, and they say this to me, this is why I went to medical school. This is why I went to nursing school. This option wasn't there for people until very recently. There was no specialty that you could train in until 2008, 3 years ago. So now there's actually a path, you know, that if you build it, they will come, and they're coming. It's amazing, the caliber of people that are choosing to work in this field, because it rekindles what they were feeling as college students when they decided to apply to medical school or nursing school. So that, I think the hope of the healthcare system is in the people who work in it. Not to mention the courage and love in patients and families that we are privileged to see and be a part of. We focus so much on the negative that we don't see the wealth and the riches are in the people. And they just need to be unleashed.
I'm wondering if anyone has any questions, and if anyone is from palliative care here at Stony Brook Medical School or has any comment that they would like to make. Yes?
My name is Dr. Khan. I happen to head a team of palliative care at one of the National Health System hospitals. And my question is very technical. Thank you very much for giving us the macro picture of what's going on. But there are so many nuances in palliative care that I just get overwhelmed going from one setting of caring for the patient to another setting. And two questions I'll ask you. One is that basically I find that the economic pressure from the hospital for me to prove how much have you done to save extra days, length of stay? And I do my calculation, and I've read your articles and some of this stuff, but they're not still happy. I don't know how to satisfy them. The second question is that some of the patients who happen to be in skilled nursing facility, and when we switch from skilled nursing facility care to hospice within the same setting, will the primary attending will still be reimbursed by the Medicare Part B?
So, as I said earlier, the system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. If we change how the system is designed, we can change those incentives. So first of all, on the hospital side, some hospital leaders are visionary and enlightened, some are not. There's a bell curve, like everything else in biological systems. So the first thing I would say to you is if you have intractable resistance from your hospital leadership in recognizing the value and impact of palliative care, get a job somewhere else. Because people are searching desperately for palliative care leaders all over the country. There's 10 jobs for every one of us. Don't stay in a place that is sapping your energy and your commitment. Seriously. And the other thing I would do is ask your CEO's own finance people to do the cost impact analyses. You shouldn't be doing that. You're not a finance person, you're a doctor. Say, you assign one of your finance people, I'm happy to work with them and give them the list of the patients and their diagnoses, and they can identify the matched control group and do the analyses. First of all, the CEO will not believe your data no matter how much time you put into it, because you're a doctor. What do you know about data? That's going to be his attitude. And secondly, if his own finance people run the numbers, he'll believe it, even if they're totally inaccurate, but it's his finance person. So I would turn that back, but I really have started to say to people, if no matter how good your work is and how much in demand and appreciated it is by patients, families, and colleagues, if your hospital administration is, determined not to recognize the value walk. The other thing that may be helpful is the new Joint Commission Advanced Certification in Palliative Care, which puts external pressure on hospitals to start to do this. I think they're all recognizing that right now it's an advanced certification, in 3 years it's an accreditation requirement. And they can either get ready for that or fail accreditation. Crosswalk. Yeah, I've been fighting for 8 years to get the Joint Commission to release this thing, because every hospital in the United States has to be accredited by the Joint Commission in order to be paid. So hospitals hate the Joint Commission, but if the Joint Commission says jump, they say how high, because otherwise they can't get paid. So the fact that the Joint Commission came out with this certification for high-quality palliative care is a very strong signal to your CEO. And you need to bring the brochure to him and show him the website. And what the Joint Commission is saying to me is that in 3 years this will be an accreditation requirement, and the advanced certification will be for systems that have integrated palliative care all across the community: nursing home, cancer center, office practice, home care. But the baseline requirement will be for hospital palliative care. So he can either, you know, start scrambling in 3 years, or start getting ready now. So use that. That's why I pushed for it, because it would give people like us leverage that we desperately need.
Any last comment, question? 30 seconds for each, and we'll take them all together and then get answer.
My comment to you is I'm a hospice nurse in the working field, and many times my problem dealing with patients is that I think that the issue at hand is really a societal issue, fear of death. And families are aware that there are aggressive modalities that they can choose to do, and they're really afraid to make the choices or discuss that with their family members before they come to see me, because by the time they've made a decision without my assessment. So my question really to you is whether or not, how do you feel the movement can take off? I mean, it really is a societal problem, and American attitude towards that, I feel, that is a real roadblock to success, to their acceptance.
And me?
It's the same question, basically. What can we do? What can we lay people do to advance the progress here right now?
And then, yes?
Is there any information on the psycho-emotional effects on doctors and nurses when their patients die without them?
And last?
Dr. Lashman, thank you for such a wonderful and informative presentation and panel. And my question is, when the government defines a palliative care for serious condition or end of life, why the serious condition or end of life? Because I would consider an adolescent coming first time with seizures, would think that person also would be benefited by palliative care.
Yeah. Okay, in reverse order, and you may have to help me remember. My view is that palliative care specialists should probably be reserved for the very complex, most seriously ill patients, but that every physician who touches a patient, every nurse who touches a patient, every social worker who touches a patient should have required training and demonstrate competencies in generalist level palliative care. Because if you have severe pain from a burn that's going to heal, you need to have a doctor who knows how to manage that. Right now you don't. So the task is to make sure that everyone gets this core training. You know, the only people who shouldn't are pathologists, I guess, because they don't touch live patients. But everyone else. And so that would be my approach to that question. There was another question there.
Doctors and nurses.
The effect on doctors and nurses has not been well studied. There's been studies in nurses about moral distress, which is associated with nurses not being able to do anything because the doctor won't let them, about suffering. Nurses wanting to treat pain, nurses wanting to treat physical and emotional distress, nurses wanting to tell the truth to patients and families who are asking but not feeling empowered to do any of that because the treating physician has the authority and won't do it. And that feeling of helpless witnessing of addressable suffering causes a lot of nurses to leave the field. And it's been labeled as moral distress in the nursing profession. What I haven't been able to find or get anyone to do is the study showing what the impact of palliative care is on turnover, retention, moral distress. That study needs to be done. The question about what can the public do, I think, is key, and thank you for remembering to ask me that. I firmly believe that although patients and families feel helpless and marginalized and as if they have no voice and as if they have no power, and particularly at a time when they're overwhelmed and distressed and upset and exhausted, but patients and families are the market. Patients and families are what this system exists to serve. Without you, there's no money, there's no nothing. There's no reason to exist. Patients and families have to demand and be the squeaky wheel for what they need within the healthcare system. I have asked people in communities to write to the CEO or write to the board chair of the hospital and say, do we have a palliative care team here? And if not, I'm taking my business to a competitor hospital that does. That'll get their notice right away, I promise you. And if they have 5 letters like that, they'll do something about it. So that's very important. The other piece that's really important is going to meet your elected representatives when they're home on recess, whether they're your state representatives or your federal representatives, and talk to them about this field and why it is important to you and what you have seen happen to friends or neighbors or family members without it, and that you want them to make sure that when they go back to do their job, they're thinking about the needs of seriously ill people in their district. Because you vote, so they care about what you think. Even though you may not be giving millions of dollars to their campaign, they can't keep their job if you don't vote for them. So you have a lot of influence, but you have to show up. And then the last thing about fear of death. And I would say that that will never be eliminated, and it is no worse in this country than it is in England, Canada, New Zealand, France. Fear of death is bred in the bone. Fear of death is an evolutionary fact. Fear of death is why the species survives. Fear of death is normal. It should not be our task to eliminate fear of death. Our task is to help people come to terms with the reality of it by listening to them, by making a safe place for those fears and anxieties to be actually named and then made conscious, by showing people that they will be safe and cared for whether they are pursuing aggressive life-prolonging treatment or not. Many people want to pursue it because without it they think they're not going to have any claim to health care. And unfortunately, in many cases, they are absolutely right. So I think a lot of people go to the ER, go to the hospital because it's that or nothing, literally, and they're scared. And they feel like they have to do what people are recommending because it's that or nothing. And until we're ready to provide something as an alternative, we shouldn't judge what people choose. And as you know, hospice is labeled, the H word is the D word in this culture. And people are terrified of it. So again, this is another reason why palliative care defined independent of prognosis is so important, because the data are very clear that patients who get palliative care early are much more likely to get to hospice with much more time left in their life and live a lot longer as a consequence of staying out of hospitals and not getting dangerous treatment towards the end of their life. So it's all part of the same public awareness process that focuses on the importance of quality of life and control and listening and not doing things to people. So the phrase is, don't just do something, stand there.
On that note, thank you, Dr. Meier, for enlightening us and giving us hope and reclaiming serious illness and death for a more compassionate and hopeful finish. And thank you all for coming.